Man, and this time we're going to be talking with Allison Gill. She's a representative of American Atheists, and they have just released a secular survey that I'm keen to find out about. Allison, what can you tell us about that?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. Well, first of all, I'm Allison Gill. I'm Vice President for Legal and Advocacy at American Atheists. And we're very excited about this new project called the U.S. Secular Survey. And this project is a result of us working on this issue for about a year. We started, the first phase of this was we did a round of focus groups at our convention this past year in Ohio. We did about 12 focus groups with about 100 people to get like a solid understanding of what issues people are facing, non-religious people across the country in their communities and how they think about different issues and their stories. And then from that, we use that information to construct this survey. So it's meant to be the largest survey of non-religious people across the country ever done. And it's going to be providing us with all sorts of incredibly useful data for advocacy, for fundraising, for working with foundations and the government, for programmatic purposes, all sorts of different uses. You can find out more about the survey at www.secularsurvey.org.
Okay, and what sort of information are you expecting to glean from this? If you can give me some specifics.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say I'm how excited I am about the responses so far. We were hoping to get 5,000 to 10,000 people in total for the project, and so far on the first day we got 12,000 people, which really it just shows the need and interest in the community in this issue. I mean, there's atheists and other non-religious folks they're not asked on any federal surveys about their beliefs. There's just no good data out there about our population in a really in-depth way. Now, there's some good demographic surveys done, like by Pew and PRRI, that talk about what is the size of the community compared to other religious beliefs held by the population at large. But that's not the same sort of in-depth information we're hoping to get through this survey. So we ask about things like, what is your experience coming to terms with being an atheist or non-religious person? Do you conceal that identity sometimes in your life? Or are you more open about it? How has your family reacted? How has your workplace? Is there any sort of circumstances where you're facing discrimination because of your identity or beliefs? What do you think about different policy issues? What's most important that we as secular organizations and a secular movement, what's most important that we focus on? What do you look for when you want to be engaged with local groups, secular groups on different issues? Like, what's most important to you? Is it about advocacy? Is it about social? That all those sorts of things. So it's just a whole range. Oh, your voting behavior. I mean, we're the large what now I think the largest, the nuns are considered the largest group of a single sort of religious belief group by most of these big surveys, and yet our voting, we vote at a lower rate than most of the other big sort of religious categories.
Yeah, we don't vote as slavishly either, because we don't have a minister telling us exactly how to vote and violating the Johnson Amendment in doing so.
Absolutely.
That's how I became an activist, by the way. I ended up talking with a number of evangelical activists in their church that were bragging how there was a coalition of ministers on the phone with each other deciding what issues they wanted to push. It was eventually what was revealed to be the wedge strategy. Mm-hmm. How they just wanted to place all these evangelicals at every level of government from school teachers on up. And they were bragging how they had already positioned certain judges and senators according to a coalition of these congregations voting the way their ministers told them to. And at the time, it was quite scary because it wasn't like the Discovery Institute is now. It was the Chalcedon Institute was the primary culprit at that time, and they were originally petitioning for to replace the representative democracy or the democratic republic with a theocracy that would enforce Levitical law, which was just about the scariest thing I could think of, and that's what prompted me to start getting involved.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're still seeing that today with Christian nationalism on its increase. We do a lot of work opposing things like Project Blitz in the States, which is this campaign to introduce Christian nationalist legislation. So yeah, no, it's still very prominent, unfortunately. But it would be great if, I think, politicians and other folks respected non-believers, non-religious people, atheists, nuns as a block that they should care about. And we're not quite there yet. We're still building our power. And I think this will help because it asks about voting behavior so that we can figure out where we need to be outreaching and how. So this survey will serve just an immense number of purposes for not just American atheists, but the entire secular movement. And this is not something we're going to keep internal. We're going to publish a report with the data when it's done. We're going to provide the data to researchers in the secular movement and other partner organizations so that they can use it for their own purposes, and we want to produce mini reports on different subpopulations and different issues. So it's going to be useful data for years and years to come.
This is interesting because when I started out as an activist back in 1997, thereabouts, I remember that the polls at that time reflected that there was only like 3% of Americans that would identify as atheist. And the surprising thing was that in subsequent polls, I would realize that the way the question is asked has a huge bearing on what the answer is. If you ask people, do you believe in God? They'll almost invariably say yes, even if they don't. Right. So if you change that, some of them will say that they believe in things that are not really a God. Well, I believe there's something. Yeah, but we all believe there's something. That doesn't tell me anything. Right? Is it a God that you believe in? So
we're not solipsists, right?
yeah. So I brought up the question to American Atheists actually a couple years back, and also to a Pew. I talked to Pew directly about asking to do a poll just to identify how many atheists there really are, because so far as I could tell, it looked like that it was 21 to 25% of Americans. This is like 5 years ago. It just depends on how you ask the question as to whether they believe in God or not, right? I mean, so I said, what if we phrase the question like, are you convinced that an actual deity really exists? Was the way that I eventually phrased the question. And I figured if you ask the question that way, you're going to get a lot more honest answer because you don't get the programmed answer. Oh, I believe in God. Like when they ask Bernie Sanders, do you believe in God? Well, of course I believe in God. And the God I believe in is we're all in this together. That's not a God, Bernie. So you have to be very careful about how the question is asked.
Yes, you're exactly right. We're actually working with a research firm called Strength in Numbers Consulting to design the survey. So it is scientifically designed. And that's one of the reasons, because we didn't want to do this just willy-nilly. It's really important to us that the data is, scientifically appropriate and useful, and it's well designed. So all the feedback I've been getting, so people really enjoy it and like it. So I'm hopeful we did a good job there. But we wanted to make this as strong as possible so that the data is useful and reportable. And I should also point out it's a little bit different than the sorts of reports you were talking about where they're asking like the whole population. This is just targeted at non-religious people as opposed to like a broader population survey. So it's what's called a convenience sample because we're just trying to get one population and doing all sorts of mechanisms to get at that one population.
So it doesn't try to establish.
Before we move on, a lot of people are commenting about the echo. Arn's echoing a little bit. Can you check your settings?
Am I echoing? Should I check my settings, or is it Arn?
If I'm echoing,
Arn's echoing. And you're wearing Allison. You're wearing headphones, right?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, I am. So that if they're hearing me echo, they're hearing me echo off your speakers.
How's that? Is that better?
I don't know. Can the audience tell if that's better? I'm not seeing any posts to that effect.
To me, it sounds like you're echoing less.
Okay, good.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
No problem. All right, so I'm gonna leave my wife to check the chat. I can't be looking at that one right now. So you're not trying to establish how many or what percentage of the American population are believers, right? That's not
correct, because that research is done, and it's done very well already by groups like Pew and PRI. In fact, I think Pew just released a new report showing that the number of nuns has increased, I think, to 26%. So that's it's
Yeah, I just wish they would walk away from the nuns thing, because I have met people who call themselves nuns who are also they're like fundamentalist Christians. They just don't have a denomination because they don't want anybody to tell them what it is. They want their imaginary God to be a very, very personal God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, I understand that. Yeah, I get that. But that's also, there are other categories they could pick, like other Christian, or so it's hard to know exactly, how people self-identify and what none really means. But this survey does focus on, and it provides, like, I think 8 different sort of non-religious identities people can choose between, including atheist, humanist, skeptic, freethinker, and several others. So it's meant to be broad and get a wide swath of our community.
Okay. And give me another example. I got to make sure to put the link to take the survey. I'm going to put that below, so it's not there now, but it will be momentarily.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Again, it's www.secularsurvey.org.
Yeah, I'm including the link below. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
They're saying the sound is better.
Great.
Very good. Very good. So, go ahead. Continue, please.
Oh, okay, sure. I'm sorry. I thought you had a question.
I didn't. We just adopted a dog, and it's decided that it wants to do playtime during the podcast. So I'm going to mute myself and try to negotiate this.
No problem. It's funny. My cat decided the same thing. She's actually sleeping up on the speakers, which is why it's quieter. All right. So what I'll talk about for a second, what we can use this information for. I mean, I think it serves a few purposes. The first is just understanding our own community. I think like that we as non-religious people and atheists think that we have a good understanding of the community based on our own experiences, based on anecdotes and just our beliefs. But honestly, without some sort of real scientific study and data collection efforts, what we're seeing is just anecdotes. And as scientists like to say, data is not the plural of anecdotes, right? You have to actually like research things in order to see what the results are and what the community looks like. There's a lot of information that we just don't know. Like, for example, do non-religious people have healthcare disparities? We know it's a stigmatized population in many, many places, and that often has, like, for example, results in mental health disparities, like higher rates of things like depression. And we don't know if that's true or not. We just have no data on it. Do we know the rates of discrimination people face, like for example, in employment, or how many young people that are non-religious or atheists are, for example, kicked out of their home? Or there's all sorts of things we don't know about the community, and without those things, we can't really talk about the issues facing the community. So
can we slow down a little bit here, Allison?
Yes.
What kind of questions are on the survey that address those specific issues?
Sure. I guess there's 3 main questions on that. There's a question that talks about negative events having to do in different areas. Like, for example, I think it's in the past 3 years, have you experienced a negative event in places like education, employment, housing, the courts, things like that? So that's one question. There's another question about whether a person, has been specific types of really significant negative events, like, for example, being physically harassed or things like that. Those are a couple. There's a question on that, and then there's a third question on like what they call microaggressions, but it's basically places where a person is made to feel less than or stigmatized because of their identity. Like, for example, if you're interacting with your family and you're always asked to pretend to be religious to make your relatives happy, right? That's a good example of a microaggression that occurs very often with non-religious people. And so there's a scale that sort of tracks those things as well. And those are just 3 examples, but it's not that long a survey. It takes like 5 to 10 minutes. Some people are reporting it takes much longer, but that's because there's open-ended questions at the end that we're receiving a lot of responses for. And our researcher actually told me she's never seen a community take so much time to put in their own open-ended, questions to add so much information there. About a third of people have so far, which is just amazing, because those will be useful, for qualitative data later for us to look at those stories and to do maybe another full project analyzing all that data. But so far, I mean, that's over 5,000 people. So you can understand that's a lot of information.
And how long do you expect the survey to be available to people? How long can people be taking it? You said you were 12,000 people on the first day. How many days we got left?
That's a good question. We originally had intended to keep it open through mid-November. I mean, I want to keep it open for a while yet. I'm not sure if we're still going to extend it through mid-November, just because we're hitting and exceeding our targets on the first day. So I can't say for sure, but at least another couple weeks. And I'm not sure if we're going to extend it through mid-November. It really depends on where we are, probably at the end of the month. But in the meantime, we want to make sure that everybody who's able to can take the survey and give their results and talk about their story. We really want to make it available for everybody.
I like how you put it that people can talk about their story, because there's an interesting aspect there. I mean, when you hear the reasons that people give for why they adopted a belief or why they got into the belief, I mean, there's only like 3 different categories for these stories to fall into. They were either raised in it and never questioned it, or they were down and out and in the gutter, and they accepted Jesus and turned their life around. And that works also for Islam and Buddhism and a number of other religions. I've heard similar stories, even in Thailand, where it was like a polytheistic thing, but they still tell the same tale. Once they accept a religious belief, suddenly their life turns around. So it's not the God that does that. You can adopt a hobby, and the same thing will still happen. But it's like 2 of the 3 categories that these kind of stories will fall into. But when you talk to people about why they came out of religion, well, now you've got a huge level of diversity. I mean, there's so many different reasons. What was it that cracked the armor? And another survey that I'd like to see is one that I'd heard reported, but I've never actually seen. I can't find this one, but I'd heard reported that there was an interview of American atheists to establish literally the atheists who were American, typically raised Christian. How did they come out of their religion? And their answer fell into 3 basic categories of that it was the tertiary answer was science. That science didn't line up with what they were learning from the religion, and the secondary answer was the hypocrisy of the church, and the primary answer, the number 1 answer, was they read the Bible. But beyond that, there's so many intricacies about what was the chink in the armor, what was the thing that got them thinking or caused them to question it for the very first time. Those are fascinating stories because they're hugely diverse, much more so than any set of particulars that you get from the people going into religion.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. We actually did some analysis of that. I talked about phase 1 of the survey we did for focus groups back at our convention. And so there was, that's a lot of the focus groups talked about their experiences of coming out of religion and why. So we have some qualitative data there. I think we're probably going to release that eventually, but it's not something that's been, we don't have the full report yet. And this survey, we don't, the questions themselves don't delve into that, but I mentioned before there's open-ended questions at the end. And one of them does talk about how people sort of first came to terms with their identity and first realized their why they're non-religious, or how they sort of resolve those issues for themselves. And so that is something we will be able to pull a lot of data from in the future. And it's qualitative data. So we didn't want to, there's so many, like you're saying, so many variations on the people's stories that we didn't want to just make it a series of like multiple choices. I think it's worth more than that.
So I'm going to be sharing the link to take the survey, not just within the video that you're watching now. I will also share that on social media to spread around. I'll remind everybody to take the survey as soon as you can, because we don't know how long it's going to be up. But it is nice that we exceed the expectations. The more, the better in a case like this. All right.
Absolutely. Yes, please take it and please send it to all your non-religious friends. And we're looking at it. There's a few places that we definitely need to get more responses to make sure that everyone is represented and that we're reaching everyone. I think there's still some holes we need to fill to make sure that we're getting everyone in the community. Like, for example, we really could use some more folks that are actively in the military or in the reserves currently. More young people age 18 to 24, which is, honestly, if you look at the statistics, those are one of the largest populations of non-religious people are in that category, and it's kind of small. So we need to do more outreach in that area. The other one is ex-Muslims. So we really need to approach more folks or have more folks take the survey that are previously of the Muslim faith. And then I think where we most critically need more outreach is among Black African-American folks, non-religious folks. So we definitely need more outreach there as well.
One of the first.
Am I right when I'm thinking that the purpose of this survey is for secular organizations, national organizations, to better understand how to advocate politically for secular people?
I would definitely say it's one of the purposes, and not just how to advocate, but to give them tools to advocate. It does talk about what are your most important issues that you think secular organizations should be advocating on, but it also just the information and what people's needs are and what they've experienced will help us advocate. And let me just give you an example so you can understand what I mean. There's a bill that we support at the federal level called the Every Child Deserves a Family Act, which is about ending discrimination when it comes to child welfare agencies, so adoption and foster care, basically. And this administration has really been pushing creating religious exemptions to allow placement agencies to both take funding from states and the federal government and also discriminate based on their religion. And we know that that does happen. Most people associate that with being LGBT, but that also does happen to non-religious folks. I mean, even here, I live in DC, liberal DC. I know people that have pretended to be religious while adopting. Like that does happen quite a bit. And so we know there's some level of discrimination or at least concealment there. And so this bill will help to alleviate that purpose. But I can't go into, I don't know, a senator or a congressman's office and talk about what percentage of folks have faced these discrimination issues while trying to adopt, because I have zero data about it. So it's not just about figuring out what to advocate for, but it's also supporting our advocacy goals by giving us data that we can use to make the case. Right now, we just as a community lack that. Does that make sense?
But we don't have representation. Yeah.
So what you're needing here is, like you're saying, data. So so you don't go to our representatives and say, I know someone who had to pretend to be religious to adopt. You have actual numbers of people that are being discriminated against in government services and things like that. So this is why as many people as possible need to take this survey. So it's not just one anecdote. It's numbers. How many people are actually experiencing this? Arn and me go to a lot of meetings around the country, and people tell us these stories. And if we could add these stories together, like things like this have happened to us too, from microaggressions to people in social services telling me I hear you don't believe what normal people believe. Like, and these stories are common. And so if we hear them a lot, but if we could put some numbers to these, and if you have a story like this that you could share in the survey, you could be helping lots of other secular people that are experiencing discrimination. Also, haven't the number of non-believers surpassed Catholics in the United States recently?
Well, the number of nuns, which is a little bit more sort of squishy, like Aaron and I were just talking about, has, yes. But again, what does that really mean? I don't know. The number of people that are identified as atheists, for example, has not. But it's still growing immensely. So it's I think, very important.
So if you ask somebody if they're an atheist, very often they'll say no because they don't know what an atheist is. Right, or they have a lot of misinterpretations about what that word means, which is why I said don't even bother with the label. just asked, are you convinced that an actual deity really exists? Yes, you're theist. No, atheist. Done. It's that simple. And then we don't have to worry about other people's misconceptions about, well, I'm agnostic because I'm a middle fence sitter. We don't have to worry about that.
Well, I have to be honest with you. The survey does allow for different options. If people want to pick agnostic or whatever, I mean, we're not going to turn them away, because I do think that they, fall.
I wasn't talking about turning them away. I want to be as inclusive as possible, right? Yet there is the nation of believers who want to say that this is a Christian country and all that, and those who are not believers are not getting representation. We're not getting any attention. So we need to be recognized as the demographic that we are. If there's the problem that we don't vote, that's true. Well, we need to fix that. But I also want people to realize that, hey, we do outnumber Catholics. We've outnumbered Jews forever, but and most recently we outnumbered the evangelicals as well. We're the Protestants, I think. Isn't it the Protestant demographic that if you divide Christianity between Catholics and the non-Catholics, that we outnumber the non-Catholics, or at least the Protestants? Is that correct?
I'd have to go back and check. I haven't looked at the latest numbers, so
okay. I think it is the Protestants.
I think it's evangelical Protestants, maybe. Like there's mainline Protestants and there's the evangelical Protestants, and there's white evangelical and black evangelical, which vote differently.
And the way that I was talking about, the way that they asked the question in a kind of a muddy way, where you have to interpret whether they're atheist or whether they're the more inclusive version of none that might include some Christians, are the people that answer the questions that they don't have a religion and religion is not important to them. Mm-hmm. That's an atheist. Whether that person knows that the A word applies to them or not, that's an atheist.
Interesting. I will say that, we do ask in the survey how people identify, and most folks have taken it as atheists, although we've seen high numbers of other as their primary sort of identity. So we give people the option to say, like, how much you identify with each of these different identities and what do you primarily go with? Because I think that'll be interesting for us to talk more about the community in the future. Mm-hmm. And to understand how people are sort of identifying themselves, because I don't think that these large surveys, like I've been talking about, these demographic surveys, they don't get at that level of detail. So we don't know, like, how many atheists are also humanists, or things like that. We don't have any information, but we'll get some really cool data from this.
There was one poll that I saw that asked a question meaning to clarify what the question was, but it backfired and it prompted answers that they didn't expect. So the poll was conducted for some national science organization. I don't remember the name of it right now, but I can find the listing if I need to. So they're interviewing a collection of scientists. Do you believe in a God or higher power? And they threw in the word or higher power to clarify what they meant by a God, right? Mm-hmm. But the scientists took it as two questions. Do you either believe in a God or do you believe in a higher power? And so there were a number of scientists who answered that they did not believe in a God, but they did believe in a higher power, whatever the hell that is. And that
I don't even know what that means.
that could include the force, right? That would literally include Einstein and Spinoza's God. That the God they believe in is not actually technically a God at all. It's just the eccentricities of nature.
Yeah.
Right. And so exactly. So this is pantheism. So. All right. So
I wanted to break this down a little bit further too. I think that when our secular organizations are talking about collecting this data, it isn't necessarily so that we have more power in the government, like per se, like to dominate the other demographics. It's so that we, when we say we're being discriminated against, even though we're roughly 20-something% of the population, like I saw on your website that about 24% of businesses in America think it's okay to deny services to atheists. Now, you're talking about roughly a fifth of Americans here. And if you think that isn't a big deal, look at what's happening in the LGBTQ community, where there have been rulings recently that some doctors don't have to provide services to trans people.
Yeah.
So like it's not going to stop there. It'll snowball.
I think you're right. I mean, that data was from the PRRI, and it was just recently issued, a report they did that looked at how Americans feel about denials of service by businesses. And they looked at different groups like LGBT people and atheists and others. And, you know, atheist was, I believe, the one right under LGBT, that people thought it was okay to deny service based on their religious beliefs. And not only that, but in just 5 years, the amount that it went up, I think the final number that they found was 24% of people think that, which is amazing. It's 1 in 4 Americans. But it had gone up 10% in just 5 years. Because, you know, the right wing is really pushing on, you know, that they should be able to discriminate against LGBT people. And I think it's just as a side effect that it's sort of becoming okay to discriminate against everybody. But I mean, that's just me guessing. I don't know, but that's my, you know, looking at the data. But it's really, you know, that's really scary if that can increase that rapidly, that sort of rapid change in people's opinions, that, you know, we've accepted as a society that discrimination is not appropriate since passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? I mean, that's sort of the civil rights era was all about fighting for that understanding, and now, you know, a lot of people are sort of moving away from it, and it's really unfortunate.
If you were to make a Venn diagram between this 24% that thinks it's okay to deny services to atheists and white evangelicals, it would be like, and I'm not focusing on the
circle. Yeah, it would be. Yeah,
so,
I think that the report probably goes into that in greater detail too.
And the issue here is we're nearly the same size population, yet our politicians are listening to this population more. They're passing laws for them more to discriminate against us. So our voices need to be heard. We deserve equal representation in our government, and we don't deserve to be discriminated against by a more vocal demographic in our country.
You're absolutely right. And that's why we have to build this political power and be able to talk about ourselves and our story. And that's, you know, organizations like the Secular Coalition for America have done a fantastic job of working to build that power by, you know, working within party caucuses and by just, you know, creating sort of voter awareness, voter engagement strategies, things like that. And of course,
somebody in the chat just said that he was discriminated against when he came to America from Australia, and mentioned in passing in a bar that he was atheist, which is, I think, a safe thing to do in Australia.
Yeah.
But in a lot of places in this country, it'll get you thrown out of the bar, which is what he says happened to him.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But I do hope you go to the survey and report it. But I am sorry to hear that. And that's exactly what we need to know. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to let you give a closing statement if you like, and we'll go ahead and flip the switch on this.
Sure.
I'm sure that you've covered everything that you need.
The U.S. Secular Survey, which you can find at www.secularsurvey.org, is open to anyone who lives in the U.S. age 18 or older, who is non-religious of any variety or stripe. And we really encourage everyone to take it and share it with as many of their non-religious friends and family as they can. We want to get as much representation as possible, and we really want your story.
Thank you. Perfect. Allison Gill, everyone, American Atheist. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.